Are you going to ask me something?
Yes, sir.
We'll introduce.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are live.
Are you going to ask me something?
Yes, sir.
We'll introduce.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. We are live. I'm hearing a delay. Shravani.
Are you going to ask me something?
Yes, sir.
We'll introduce.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Sir, did you open any other tabs?
No.
I think it should be fine now. I corrected something.
Okay.
Go ahead. It should be fine now.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the live streaming of episode 7 from the documentary series PV Change with Continuity. We express our sincere gratitude to the Honorable Chief Minister of Telangana, Shri K. Shekhar Rao Garu, Shri PV Narasimha Rao Centenary Celebrations Committee, and Telangana Sahitya Academy for making this event possible. Today, our guest is Mr. Shekhar Gupta. Mr. Shekhar Gupta is one of the senior and most towering journalists we have in the field of news media today. He is the founder and the editor-in-chief of The Print, a digital news outlet, and a columnist for the Business Standard. He has started his early days of journalism at the Indian Express and India Today and went on to lead and guide the journalism at both the groups at various points of his career. He is a recipient of several respectable awards, including the Padma Bhushan, for his excellence at his work. The series of Walk the Talk that he has done for NDTV and National Interest written for India Today are widely watched and read. After founding The Print, he has been featuring in Cut the Clutter, Off the Cuff, and National Interest. Despite being a senior, serious political journalist, Mr. Shekhar Gupta never misses an opportunity to bring his style of humor and his favorite cricket analogies into his news analysis. Thank you so much, sir, for being here. And now we will watch a small part of the episode 7, and we will engage Shri Shekhar Gupta in a conversation. Post your reflections on the episode and your questions on the live chat section below.
India refused to sign the NTT. Pakistan also didn't. Israel also didn't. Now, in doing that, the other countries said, so what are you assuring us? What are you doing for us? You want to keep your nuclear weapons in perpetuity, but you are not either following the fact that you should give it up or get other nations to do that. So let us bring the comprehensive test ban treaty. But that caught us in a bind. Because Mr. Narasimha Rao had seconded the UN resolution, thinking that he had 10 years. Suddenly it was reduced to 2 or 3 years. It looked odd if India says, no, we don't want this resolution anymore. So he told the scientists that we must now proceed in terms of a test. So then what happened was that a separate committee was set up to supervise the entire testing program. If you wanted to do a test, within a 10-day window, they should be able to do it. That required 4 or 5 things. One, you had to get the core ready for a test. And he also gave clearance for a hydrogen bomb test. So we had developed the atom bomb. We had developed what is called a boosted fission bomb. Just to give you an example, if, for instance, Delhi, Connaught Place. So Connaught Place will be destroyed with an atom bomb. Boosted fission bomb will bring it right up to the Habitat Center and everything else. And hydrogen bomb will take much of Delhi. So during Narasimha Rao's period, he also sanctioned the hydrogen bomb. So he said, we will test an atom bomb, we will test a boosted fission bomb and start developing the hydrogen bomb. 3 big orders he gave.
My recollection is that, I forget now whether it was 94 or early 95, we were asked in the finance ministry to make an assessment, maybe sometime late 94, to make an assessment that if the country were to have a test, what would be the external implications. But we had no idea then whether they were planning to do a test or not.
Because it was a very secretive program. So the Prime Minister, along with his Principal Secretary, could be, or the cabinet secretary, as Mr. Naresh Chandra was, principal secretary Mr. Amarnath Verma during Mr. Narasimha Rao's time. They would then decide and give the orders to the DRDO, the Atomic Energy Commission, to the Air Force, and say, this is what we need to do, gentlemen. Now let's get down to doing it. So the committee is a very close-knit committee. It is a secretive committee. He doesn't report to Parliament. No one knows really what it does except the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the only person, along with one or two key officials, who are fully aware of the extent of the development of the bomb and what position it is. He used to tell both Dr. Chidambaram, who was Atomic Energy Chief at that time, as well as Dr. Kalam, that do not speak much about it. He would tell them as much as saying, shut up. A separate committee was set up to start work at Pokhran, to dig the shafts. Though the shafts had been dug for a nuclear test, two shafts had been dug in 1981 when Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi had come to power again. She had wanted tests to happen. Those shafts were again revived.
Narasimha Rao gave an order to test the bomb around December 95, right? And as I point out in the book, the nuclear testing has several different stages. I think it's T-21, then you give one order 14 days before testing, if I remember right. Then then 7 days, then 3 days, then 1 day. And once you give, once the Prime Minister gives an order 1 day before testing, it's hard to rescind. So we know he gave the first 2 orders for testing, right? And we also know that a couple of days before the actual testing, 3 or 4 days before the actual testing, the bomb had already been lowered into the hole.
When the American ambassador brought the pictures, their own satellite pictures of this blast site, of being cleaned and being prepared, to the Prime Minister's office, A.N. Verma refused to see them in the American ambassador's hands. He said, I don't understand these pictures. Give them to me, I will check. Knowing that American ambassador will never hand them over to him.
Mr. Verma then goes up to speak to Mr. Rao to inform him that Frank Wisner, who was the US ambassador at that time, was there. And Mr. Rao tells Mr. Verma, reportedly says, these are all conversations that I picked up after research, says, tell the ambassador to tell his president that I keep my word. Now, I keep my word is a very mysterious sentence. What was his word?
Narasimha Rao gave an order to cancel the testing. We know this, right? The evidence is very clear. I've both read and seen enough to know that this is the fact. The question is, why did he do it, right? That he wanted to test to begin with is pretty clear, because India had the capability and he wanted to send a signal to the world, right? The reason where the puzzle is why did Narasimha Rao at the last minute stop testing?
Was his word that he would never do a test when he was Prime Minister? That was the big controversy. Was his word that he would not do a test till the NPT was signed or just before it was signed? Was that a commitment? Was he succumbed to CIA pressure or American pressure after seeing the photographs and didn't do a test? Was he so scared of doing a test in the first place that he very easily buckled under?
Everybody knew that when India tests, there will be heavy consequences. There will be sanctions, there will be other issues.
Look, there will be a negative external reaction. And we had just about recovered from the crisis. So we certainly didn't say that, the negative reaction would be so strong that is not worth testing. And I'm sure he was a shrewd person. And he would have made, I don't believe the sanctions is what would have stopped him.
In an interview to one of the television channels, I think it was to Shekhar Gupta.
When I keep asking him to tell me more about why he aborted those nuclear tests,
he said, if there's anyone who came closest to the answer of what I did was Raj Chekkappa. Now that is a backhanded compliment, which means I still don't know everything that was there on this matter.
And finally, sitting there, he pats his belly and he says, "Bhai, kuch to mere saath chita mein jaane do."
My sense is, and I think all the evidence points towards this, but I'm not 100% sure, that Narasimha Rao had no intention in testing.
So one theory, it went with Rao in his belly, but one theory which I tend to believe is more that he played a game.
First, let me just tell you the facts that we know, and then what we can speculate, right? The first fact that we know is that by around mid to late 95, India had the ability to explode a normal fission bomb, a nuclear bomb. We had the ability, right? It's also clear that we did not have the ability to explode a hydrogen bomb, right? We did not have it. And it's also pretty clear that India would not have two chances to explode weapons.
You will only be able to test once, not twice. Because once you test and all sanctions come, then you deal with them. You can't test again 2 years later, 3 years later, 5 years later.
So logically, Narasimha Rao would not have wanted to test once now, which is December 95, and then wait to test in a year or so later when a hydrogen bomb was ready. But he wanted to send a very clear signal to the West that India has the ability. So he gave the order for testing.
There was a cleaning of the tunnels, etc., and there was enough activity to suggest that there was going to be testing.
And he, and I suspect people close to him like Naresh Chandra, again I don't have evidence for that, deliberately leaked the information, right? They deliberately made it, available to America, so that then the New York Times would write about it, Bill Clinton would put pressure, and Narasimha Rao would say, look, I have the ability, I was going to test, but I'm not doing it.
At least that is a theory that I believe. And he played this sort of a diabolical game with the Americans.
And in doing so, he achieved both things. He was able to signal to the West that India is nuclear capable, while not inviting the sanctions that would come with an actual nuclear test.
He didn't want to test early because he didn't want to jeopardize the NPT. And that was a commitment, in some senses, a silent commitment he made to the Western countries, including President Clinton. We needed the nuclear non-proliferation treaty as much as any other country. Without it, every other country could develop bombs. We also want a nuclear order. Now, if India tested at that particular time, many nations would not have signed the NPT.
And I think that by about April 96, about 5-6 months later, the hydrogen bomb was ready and he was serious about testing.
By the time the thermonuclear weapon was ready, it was too late. The election was more or less going on. And testing at that point would be, it would be like going to the public, making this into an election campaign.
And Narasimha Rao decided not to test, right? Because he felt he didn't have the mandate, which again is an act of patriotism, right? A lot of other prime ministers, even if they don't have the mandate, they'll say, go ahead and test, right?
So what do you think about this bit?
You're asking me?
Yes, sir.
Well, I think between Raj, actually Raj is a student of this historically, in the sense that is a student of the history. So I go by his description. I make my guesswork and my assessment, having known Narasimha Rao, the politician, that he always dealt with calculated ambiguity. And in this case, I was always convinced that he had no intention of testing, that he was going through the whole charade. And sometimes this kind of games have to be played in such a way that they look convincing to you as well, to all your team, because you know that finally you can pull it off. And I don't think anybody was heartbroken in Delhi at that point, in South Block or anywhere, or in what used to be 7RCR at that point, that the Americans had found out. I think the Americans were expected to find out, because I also heard later that a lot of the tunnel clearing work was carried out on moonlit nights, when it's easier for satellites to pick up more details. So they wanted to be caught. And if that was the reason, if that is the truth, that is guesswork, but I think educated guesswork. If that guess is correct, then he had never meant to test. Also, doing such an audacious thing was not his way. His way was to move very slowly, even economic reform. We saw one lot of the reform. After that, for the rest of the period, he was mostly trying to do his usual socialist type of stuff, not that as aggressively as Sonia Gandhi might have done later, but usual stuff. So at one point he did that. He gave the economy a fillip and then let it be. In any case, in about 2 years, he was quite damaged because of the various scandals and other issues. And we know that 92 December, Ayodhya had come down. So after that, he had become very weak. So I go with the view that he had never meant to test. So just as you have strategic defiance, this is strategic messaging. And this is strategic messaging to say that, look, I can do it. I had it all ready. Now, who's to know whether he had the hydrogen bomb ready, thermonuclear bomb ready at that point or not? I have my bombs ready, right? You can keep guessing what bombs are these. That is taking nuclear ambiguity to the next level. Again, from what I understand, and what Vinay also confirms, that India was not yet ready for a reliable thermonuclear device. That still needed some more time. So one conversation that I know, sort of not exactly secondhand, almost firsthand, is Narasimha Rao telling Atal Bihari Vajpayee at some point when the transition was taking place, कि सामग्री हमने तैयार कर दी है, अब आप कर लीजिएगा. So I think one thing that stands out is that he completely eschewed the temptation of making one desperate bid to get re-elected by testing it just before that, because he knew it would be misunderstood.
So from blaming Narasimha Rao for Babri demolition to making sure that he didn't get a resting place in Delhi, Congress party systematically disowned and tried to erase Narasimha Rao from history. But surprisingly, last year in July, Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi issued statements praising Narasimha Rao for his role in transforming Indian economy. What is your analysis on this?
Well, I think, I can only guess. I think they also must have got a little bit worried that BJP the BJP under Amit Shah and Narendra Modi is happy to take all of the Congress party's icons except anybody from the Gandhi family. They've taken their side of the Gandhi family, that is Menika and Varun Gandhi, but nobody from the ruling dynasty side of the Gandhi family. Anybody else, they took Patel first. Patel, Madan Mohan Malviya, although he was even then a man way off the right in the past, Lal Bahadur Shastri. Increasingly, they've been also encroaching on Narasimha Rao. Also, local politicians, local parties in Andhra have done that. So I think there was some bit of concern there that you have to do it, but I don't believe that they are doing it with any conviction.
So when he's born, do you remember the year 2004, sir? I mean, when you interviewed him just 2 months before his death, I guess.
Yes.
So how was your? I actually watched the entire. He used to collect all the archives of his interviews, and I watched the entire unedited version that you gave him. Probably how was interviewing him?
Well, I had met him many times, and he would talk. And he talks even one-on-one, he talks the same way as it's the interview. He's very cagey, very cautious, and you have to be very alert, and you have to read between the lines. You have to banter with him, then he joins the banter, and he gives you some good lines. So he was, I don't think he particularly wanted to open up and tell me his life story as he had never spoken about. But I think over time, a certain affection had developed. So he was happy to talk over a long period. It's a very long interview. We ran this in 2 parts, but it's much longer than that. And I remember it was very tiring for him. At the end of it, he sat down under, I think, a peepal tree or a banyan tree in his house, like an old Guruji giving Updesh. But he did not duck anything. In fact, I asked him that your party is not even fielding you in the elections. Why do you still stick to the party? Your party treats you so badly. And he said, भाई अब मैं तो सारा जीवन तो मैं कांग्रेस में रहा हूँ. And then he said, मैं कोई यशवंत सिन्हा तो नहीं हूँ कि पार्टी छोड़ के चला जाऊंगा. Of course, when this happened, and I quoted this, Yashwantji was upset, and he did explain to me that Narasimha Rao was perhaps unkind to him. But this is the crack he took, and the fact is that he never left the Congress party, and he never spoke against the Congress party.
So how was he slowly got separated from Congress system? Because essentially post 96 he was the head of the party, and how did he lose the grip on Congress party so easily after 96?
He didn't lose the grip. He never had the grip for long enough. I was in Tirupati at the AICC session, the first AICC session he held, and that's where they elected the CWC first, and then they cancelled the election, and then they did it by nomination. So he was trying to do it the old high command way. But there were many in the Congress party who thought they were as tall as Congress leaders as him, or in fact, if not taller. And the most prominent of them was Arjun Singh. So from day one, he had resentment, he had trouble, he had politicking in his cabinet. And some of the things he could get done is because either he had a non-politician, then Dr. Manmohan Singh, or he had Chidambaram heading commerce, etc., because he had just come into politics. So he had his challenges in the cabinet to begin with. And soon enough, both in his cabinet and his party, people started going to Sonia and whispering about him. Because the moment they figured that she is willing to listen, she was not doing anything, then they started filling her ears, as they say, to transliterate from Hindi, kaan bharne lage. And that went on. And I think by the time of mid-92, much before Babri Masjid, he was spoiled goods for the Congress party. And then we know that the Congress split, Congress T came up, many people left, and they all said that he had given up the Congress party's secular ideology. In fact, some even said that first the guy gave up the Congress party's socialist ideology with reforms. Now he's given up Congress party's secular ideology. And there were jokes, not so much from BJP people or leftists, but from Congress people that, check out under his dhoti, he must be wearing khaki shorts and stuff like that. So I think he was finished by then. And Arjun Singh finished him. I mean, he led the move. As he later finished Devagowda's government also. I mean, his hope was somehow that he will get the job. He never got it. And that's why he got very bitter in 2004 when he was denied again. And for him, it was a very unkind cut, because the first time he thought there was a chance, Narasimha Rao denied it to him. The second time he thought he was a chance, Narasimha Rao had got into politics, denied it to him. And he always blamed the Gandhi family for it.
In fact, he had written a whole book accusing Narasimha Rao. It's kind of Narasimha Rao's biography. And every chapter you will find Narasimha Rao.
Yes, so, he was very angry, and also he was a fantastically skilled politician. I mean, matching Narasimha Rao in a way, except that he never got power. If he had become prime minister, I would like to imagine what kind of prime minister he would be, because he was a lot more, in some ways, a lot more ruthless than Narasimha Rao. Also, much more single-minded in his pursuit of power.
Yeah. So, and one question is, I watched a lot of his speeches he delivered during the election campaign, and even in your interview just before he died, he was not accepting his role as someone who has transformed India, as someone who opened up the economy. He was more happy to be looked at as a socialist politician who introduced midday meals, or all the schemes that he started from 91 to 96. Even most of his speeches during the election campaign, 90% of the time he would spend time on explaining those schemes. So why do you think he was not accepting his role? And do you think,
Carry on.
I mean, and there are few interviews where he expressed he was not happy with the way reforms have progressed. He was talking about inequality. He was talking about opening the doors wide open, and that has consequence of destroying domestic industries and crony capitalism. And he was expressing his worries that reforms could have the human face was missing in the reforms, especially after 96.
See, first of all, he was no instinctive reformer. He was an instinctive socialist. He traced his politics back to Telangana movement of the past. He was an instinctive politician and socialist. He was not an instinctive reformer, but he was a pragmatic politician. He could see the reality instead of ignoring it. So 1991, he saw that reality and let it happen. Was it very thrilled in his heart? I don't think so. I think he knew that he was taking a big risk against his ideological instinct and again against his upbringing. But he did that. And he did that a few more times after that. For example, his opening out to Israel, upgrading his relations with Israel. Again, that is something that you would normally not expect a Congress government to do, that too in 1992. But he figured at that point that the Cold War had ended. And from India's point of view, the wrong side had won the Cold War. The right side, that is the Soviet bloc, had lost the Cold War. So he knew that he needed to make those adjustments. So he was not heartbroken. Maybe deep inside he was heartbroken, but he was not going to stick to the past. So he also figured out ways of reaching out to the Western bloc. And one of those was opening up to Israel. And that is again something that the Congress party ideologically was very upset about. And that story was also taken to the higher up, saying, see what's he doing? Is this why Nehru-ji and Indira-ji and Rajiv-ji built this pro-Palestinian policy in India? He's given it up. Why is he doing it? Second thing is that he was genuinely worried about what he had unleashed. It is like, if a tiger is in a zoo for 60 years, 55 years, and suddenly you open the zoo door. So tiger comes out and figures what's going on. So a leader in India doing what he did in 1991, he was not an instinctive reformer. For him to think, so he would also absorb these stories, the poor are suffering. There's always poverty in India. There's much less now than it was in 91. In fact, the reform lifted a lot of people above the poverty line, but there's always poverty. At that point, there was enormous amount of poverty. Where Narasimha Rao came from, where he won his elections usually, there was a lot of poverty in those parts of Telangana or what was then Andhra. So he always had this doubt, am I doing the right thing or not? In fact, even in that interview, he mentions it. He says that they kept on saying, and it's very relevant right now, please watch that clip in the interview. He said, ये सब कहते हैं कि सारा public sector को privatize कर दो, LIC को कर दो. I will not give my LIC to anybody, right? Or today that LIC is being listed on the stock market. I'm not saying it's being given away to anybody, but it's now being put in public. But he was very protective of all these assets, and he was not going to touch any public sector because he was still a very old-fashioned. He was not a Gorbachev. He was not a Gorbachev, and he was always conscious that he had done something which was against his grain, and had gone back to the usual Congress language. Also, within his party, there was far too much criticism of the reform. There was far too much criticism of the reform, and then people who were rebelling in his party, they were making it a big issue. Remember that after Congress lost power, and Antony, I think the first Antony committee was set up to look into the Congress disaster. That Antony committee blamed economic reform for that disaster. So he was getting those vibes also. and he was responding to that. And I don't think he was responding to it purely cynically. He was responding to it because he always had doubts as well. In fact, if you watch that interview, when I asked him, how did you make a U-turn on the economy? He said, no. In a country like India, you can never be seen to be made a U-turn. So then I said something like that. So how does Narasimha Rao make a U-turn without anybody realizing that he's made a U-turn? So he said something like, suppose the ground under you is moving. So that was his method. He did not want to embrace that economic reform to say, I have done it, fantastic, because he knew that within his party, there was almost no support for it.
So we have a lot of questions from audience and we only have 10 minutes. So
Okay, go ahead. I'll give you short answers now.
Okay. Mr. Srinivas Vinjamur is asking, you mentioned about your first meet with PV after your Afghan visit. Can you please talk on PV's analysis on Afghan problem?
Well, PV knew that India had its stake in Afghanistan. He knew that the government that was there in Afghanistan, Najibullah's government backed by the Soviets, was a government that India wanted there. He also knew that Pakistan was a partner with America, China, and the rest, along with the Mujahideen. So he had to keep his relationship with that government. But he also had doubts that that Najibullah government would have the ability to survive a very long time or for too long, particularly as the Soviet bloc had already declined. So those were the issues on his mind. And he was looking at the future there itself. And he also knew that there was a lot of, there were warlords in Afghanistan. The government didn't control everything. As it always happens in Afghanistan, anybody who rules Kabul has to have a critical number of the warlords on his side. And that can change very quickly overnight. So he understood all that. He understood Afghan history. He also understood the history of India's ties with Afghanistan, the subcontinent's ties with Afghanistan.
So Rishik is asking about Narasimha Rao's strategy on dealing with Pakistan and Kashmir issue.
Mostly he dealt with Pakistan with benign neglect. He did not make any major initiative. He did a few things here and there. And then at one point, when Benazir Bhutto was Prime Minister in her second term, she made a statement that got him very upset. She said something like, when Rajiv Gandhi was there, or when the Gandhi family was there, you could deal with them. I don't remember her exact words, but implying that you could deal with the equals. Now you have people like this who deals with them. So I don't think Narasimha Rao ever said it because it's also a sort of Americanism. But I think what he meant was, I will make a horrible example of you. Because he was very hurt by this statement. And then you see, nobody gives him the credit for what he did in Punjab and Kashmir. He carried out the most ruthless fight back in India's history against separatist militancy and terrorism in Kashmir and Punjab at the same time. Both had, if you watch film Haider, that is the phase that film Haider features. So that was a very brutal response. And as that happened, and Benazir went from capital to capital across the world, building the case against India on Kashmir, he cleared up the situation on the ground and he gave KPS Gill and Beant Singh, the Chief Minister in Punjab, a free hand, resources, everything to also end terrorism in Punjab. Once that was happened, Pakistan had no hand to play with.
Rishik has another question. He's asking, there are accusations from some quarters that Mr. Rao used intelligence agencies to keep check on politicians in opposition and acted with vengeance. How true is that?
Well, I am sure he did. And frankly, everybody does when in power. He might have done a bit more than others at that point. But I don't think if you look at the political history of India, he was the most intrusive. His was the most intrusive of the governments. But yes, he did use the agencies and then the whole Hawala scam. We don't know exactly what happened, although everybody believed that he had orchestrated it to finish a lot of people he saw as rivals. I, for example, it's guesswork. I was persuaded to believe, I'm still persuaded to believe, that the reason L.K. Advani was arraigned in the Hawala scam was mostly because Narasimha Rao was bitter with him. Narasimha Rao thought he had been let down very badly by him in Ayodhya, because Narasimha Rao relied on his assurances that nothing will happen. And that didn't happen. And that day Narasimha Rao knew that he was finished as a politician, definitely finished as a Congress leader. And his legacy would be the demolition of Babri Masjid. He blamed Advani for it. And I do believe, I wrote about this also, so I'm only telling you what I've written, that he thought that Advani had let him down. It was Advani's betrayal, and he should also be made to pay for it. And really, it took away at least a few years from Advani's political life as he fought these cases. May have denied him prime ministership at some point, I don't know.
Mr. Srinath is asking, there is an opinion among many circles that economic reforms package was nothing but an obvious turn which India had to take to save itself in 1991. PVNR, incidentally, was the Prime Minister. What is your take on this?
Well, as we say in cricket, somebody may bowl a full toss at you, but you still have to hit it for 4. You can hit it to a fielder, you can lob it up in the air and get caught. Somebody has to do it, or you can just pat it defensively. So somebody has to do it. I think to say that this is bound to happen is okay. There were circumstances. Even before he came in, Chandrasekhar had sent out India's gold to avoid a balance of payments crisis. Even before Narasimha Rao had come in, Chandrasekhar had brought in Manmohan Singh and put him in a position as advisor to Prime Minister, where he attended cabinet meetings. So he was getting Dr. Manmohan Singh ready for that role. So something would have been done. But the way it was done, in this spectacular manner, and the manner in which India reached out to IMF for that bailout, that requires courage. Because, in India, given the kind of nationalism, the spirit we have, to go to IMF, to accept what is called as conditionalities, that needs a fair bit of heart. And he showed that.
We have one more question. How differently would you like to see the image of Narasimha Rao going down in history?
Well, I'd like him to be seen fairly. He was by no means perfect. He had many flaws. He was also an accidental prime minister. It's wrong to call Manmohan Singh an accidental prime minister. There, the High Command chose him. In Narasimha Rao's case, he was an accidental prime minister because Rajiv Gandhi got assassinated in the middle of an election campaign after one round of voting was over. So he wasn't there, and so accidentally he got in. He did remember him for the good things he did, the economic reform, changes on foreign policy, something that people don't remember adequately, the complete destruction of terrorism and terror network at that point in Kashmir and in Punjab. Remember, that was also a period in Kashmir when a lot of foreign terrorists were also coming. There were some Sudanese caught, there were some others caught also. That is where pan-Islamism, pan-Islamic terror had begun to grow. And those were the early days when Osama bin Laden had also emerged. He was financing a few organizations, and Al-Qaeda came up in its wake. Now, if India was left with the legacy of continuing insurgency in Kashmir and Punjab, India would have been left a very insecure country. So he left India internally a much more secure country than before. Those are the positive legacies. Negative legacies, I'd say, first of all, the kind of methods he used to stay in power, because he was a minority government. So, the JMM case and everything. So he took politics down to the lowest common denominator in many areas. Then his failure to save or keep his commitment on Babri Masjid, because, that was a challenge to India's constitution and he did not live up to it. He failed. And third, I would say, how quickly he's lost his nerve with economic reform. And I think the reason that happened was that until about 3 years, he was still hoping that he'll somehow get re-elected. Or that in whatever election takes place, there will probably be a coalition and he'll be the most obvious choice. It's only towards his 4th year and then 5th year that he knew that his game was over.
So do you have time to take one more question?
So do you think he went into the election knowing that he would lose it?
Most certainly. I even flew with him once to Jammu for his election rally, and we did an interview on the plane, and I could see that, he knew that he was going to lose. And he was making obviously he would not say that he was going to lose, but he was going through the motions, and he was it was quite evident from his tone and method.
Yeah. So on that note, we'll end today's talk, sir. Thank you so
very
much for
much.
coming. And so all the episodes of PV Change with Continuity 8 episode series is available on the channel that is Vijayanagara channel that is streaming. This live conversation is streaming. And tomorrow we are going to play some archives of Narasimha Rao, video archives. We have 7 live conversations on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Thank you, audience, for attending this session. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And congratulations, Shekhar and Shravani. You've done a fantastic job.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Stay well.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir.